The clock face read 4:45 a.m. The world was still held in the grip of a pre-dawn stillness, the air over the Westerplatte garrison thick with the damp chill of September. Then, the silence broke. The battleship Schleswig-Holstein unleashed its heavy guns, a thunderous roar that tore through the morning mist and vibrated deep into the earth. The first shells slammed into the garrison with a force that turned stone to dust and night into a jagged, burning horizon. It was not merely an attack. It was the sound of a continent splintering. The shock waves rippled outward, carrying the finality of a closing door. Where birds had been singing moments before, there was now only the rhythmic, mechanical thud of artillery and the sharp, metallic tang of cordite hanging in the air. The garrison guards scrambled, their boots hitting the gravel, but the rhythm of the bombardment was already absolute. Every shell that landed erased the last remnants of a fragile peace. The world held its breath, and in that vacuum, the Second World War began. History had turned a page, and the ink was still wet with the fire of the opening salvo. The horizon in Pomerania and Silesia did not brighten with the sun. It darkened with the arrival of the German columns. Thousands of engines ignited simultaneously, a low-frequency hum that rapidly escalated into a deafening, metallic roar. The morning birdsong was silenced, replaced by the rhythmic grinding of treads against asphalt and the high-pitched whine of gears. Across the border, the planes began to tremble. The earth itself seemed to recoil under the weight of the advancing steel. This was not a slow march. It was a surge, a coordinated tide of iron moving with cold, calculated speed. Panzers tore through the countryside, their exhaust plumes staining the clear sky, while supply trucks followed in an endless, disciplined line. Every bridge, every crossroads, and every village path was swallowed by the mechanical advance. The sheer momentum left no room for hesitation. The invasion was a singular, industrial force, moving with a precision that defied the chaos of the battlefield. While the ground shook under the tread of engines, the true architect of this destruction sat in a silent room, miles from the front. Weeks earlier, the map of Europe had been dismantled with a fountain pen. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not a treaty. It was a death warrant signed in secret. Hitler and his counterparts had carved up the continent, treating borders like lines on a ledger. This political betrayal acted as the final, invisible catalyst, ensuring the Soviet Union remained a silent partner in the coming annihilation. Poland was no longer a sovereign state in the eyes of these giants. It was a pawn, a buffer zone to be erased. The realization of this entrapment was absolute. There was no escape route, no diplomatic sanctuary, and no hope of neutrality. The nation was pinned between two totalitarian powers, both waiting for the signal to close the vice. Every soldier on the front line was fighting a war that had already been decided in a boardroom. The ink on the pact was dry. The secret protocols were in motion, and the fate of millions had been traded away before the first shell had even left the barrel. The invasion was merely the physical manifestation of a cold, calculated design. The doctrine was simple. Speed as a weapon. German panzer divisions did not engage in the traditional, grinding attrition of the past. They moved like a scalpel, slicing through the Polish defensive lines with ruthless, surgical precision. Where the Polish army expected a front, they found only empty space and the distant growing rumble of engines behind their own positions. Static fortifications, once considered impenetrable, were bypassed in minutes. The panzers ignored the strong points, leaving them isolated. Communication lines snapped. Commanders at the front received reports of enemy units appearing in sectors that were supposed to be miles behind. The speed of the advance created a frantic, suffocating sense of disorientation. Divisions were encircled before they could even deploy their artillery. Orders became impossible to relay, and the chain of command fractured. Every hour, the map changed. Every hour, the pocket of resistance grew smaller. The Blitzkrieg was not just a movement of machines. It was the systematic dismantling of an army's ability to react. By mid-September, the Polish army faced a choice: total collapse or a desperate, singular gamble. They chose the Bzura. Thousands of men gathered in the river valley, a final, concentrated mass of infantry and artillery aimed at the flank of the advancing German columns. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, cordite, and the heavy, metallic tang of anticipation. As the order to advance was given, the silence of the valley shattered. For a few hours, the momentum shifted. The Polish forces surged forward, reclaiming ground and forcing the German units to reel back. It was a flicker of defiance, a moment where the tide seemed to turn, but the sky held the true verdict. The low, rhythmic drone of engines grew into a deafening roar as waves of aircraft descended upon the valley. The ground erupted in fire. Stuka dive bombers hammered the exposed Polish positions with relentless precision, turning the counterattack into a bottleneck of burning steel. German reinforcements poured into the sector, sealing the gaps and grinding the Polish effort into the mud. The Bzura became a graveyard of ambition. The defeat at the Bzura had barely settled into the soil when the horizon shifted again. On the morning of September 17, the silence of the eastern border was broken by the rhythmic, heavy clatter of treads. Polish border guards, exhausted and scanning for any sign of relief, watched as a massive column of armor emerged from the mist. They were not the expected reinforcements. They were not the allies that had been promised. The red star painted on the steel turrets signaled the final, crushing betrayal. The Red Army had crossed the border in force, executing the secret protocols that had been signed in the shadows of August. The news traveled through the remaining command posts with the speed of a death sentence. There was no battle here, only the systematic occupation of the rear. The Polish state was now physically squeezed between two totalitarian giants, each carving its own path of destruction. Logistics hubs, supply depots, and the last remaining pockets of organized resistance in the east were overrun before they could even pivot to face the new threat. The dream of a two-front defense vanished in an instant. With the west already burning and the east now falling, the nation was effectively severed. The soldiers who had fought for weeks to hold the line now found themselves trapped in a closing vice, with no ground left to retreat to and no hope of a reprieve. The map was being redrawn in real time. Warsaw became the final, burning theater of the campaign. The sky turned black as squadrons of Stuka dive bombers circled above, their engines screaming in a rhythmic, terrifying descent. Each whistle of a falling bomb was followed by the thunderous collapse of stone and glass. The city center, once a hub of life, dissolved into a choking cloud of brick dust and smoke. Defenders scrambled through the debris, but the bombardment was relentless. It did not target military positions alone, but the very foundation of the city. As the dust settled, the conflict moved into the streets. Every intersection became a kill zone. Soldiers and civilians alike took cover behind shattered walls, firing into the haze. As armored vehicles ground through the wreckage of homes and shops, the sound of gunfire echoed endlessly between the jagged remains of apartment blocks. There was no front line anymore, only a labyrinth of rubble where every room and every alleyway had to be contested. The city was being dismantled, floor by floor, street by street. Fire spread unchecked from one neighborhood to the next, casting a hellish glow over the ruins. Warsaw was no longer a capital. It was a cage of fire. The ammunition ran dry in the final hours of September 27. Defenders who had held their positions for weeks behind piles of masonry found their magazines empty and their supply lines severed. There were no more shells for the artillery, no more cartridges for the rifles, and no more strength to hold the barricades. The relentless pressure of the encirclement had reached its absolute limit. A white flag appeared above the ruins of the city center, a stark contrast against the soot-stained sky. Then, the sound stopped. The artillery fire ceased. The constant, vibrating roar of engines faded into the distance. A profound, heavy silence settled over the shattered streets, broken only by the settling of debris and the distant crackle of dying fires. Soldiers emerged from the cellars and the rubble, their hands raised, their movements slow and mechanical. They walked into the open to find a city that no longer functioned. The government buildings were hollowed shells. The streets were impassable rivers of brick and twisted iron. The capital had fallen. The organized resistance that had defined the last month of the nation's life was gone. What remained was a landscape of broken stone and the stillness of a defeated era. The 5-day campaign had reached its terminal point, leaving behind a capital silenced by the weight of total occupation. The era of independence had ended. The ink on the surrender documents had barely dried before the new order took hold. Germany claimed the West, while the Soviet Union moved in from the East, meeting in the center to finalize the partition. The map was redrawn in blood, carving the nation into administrative zones of control. Immediately, the occupiers began the systematic dismantling of Polish society. Lists were compiled in government offices, and trucks began rolling into neighborhoods before dawn. Men and women were pulled from their homes, forced into lines, and marched toward waiting transport. The sound of heavy boots on cobblestones became the new rhythm of daily life. Arrests were not isolated incidents. They were a calculated campaign to remove the leadership, the intellectuals, and anyone capable of organizing resistance. While Britain and France had issued declarations of war weeks earlier, they remained behind their own lines, leaving the occupied territories alone. This was not merely the end of a campaign. It was the prologue to a catastrophe. The 5-day destruction was the first gear to turn. The silence of the fallen capital was the prelude to a global conflagration that would alter the course of history forever.